80,000 men, a frozen field. By military logic, the victor was already decided before the first blow. But one commander saw what no one else saw: the wind. And he was about to weaponize the invisible air to obliterate England's finest army. March 29th, 1461, Yorkshire. The blizzard is brutal. The bloodiest day in British history is about to begin. Not with a heroic speech, but with a question. How do you turn nature into a weapon of mass destruction? England was devouring itself. York against Lancaster, the War of the Roses. On one side, the unstable King Henry VI. On the other, the young warrior Edward IV. But this was not a war fought in negotiating chambers. It was a war of extermination. Entire noble families were destroyed. Lands were burned. Alliances shifted like the wind. And in 1461, both sides knew the next confrontation would be decisive. Whoever won would control the throne. Whoever lost would vanish from history. Edward IV needed a crushing victory. He had claimed the crown, but his legitimacy depended on proving he could win on the battlefield. And that's why he gathered his forces in Yorkshire, knowing the Lancastrians would come with everything to crush him before he could consolidate his power. The Lancastrian commander was Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. A war veteran, cruel and calculating, who led the largest military force assembled in England in decades. He had numbers. He had elite heavy cavalry, fully armored knights who could punch through enemy formations like a hot blade cutting through butter. He had the confidence of someone who knew the Yorkists couldn't win a frontal battle. On the Yorkist side was William Edward, the Duke of Norfolk, the commanding general. A man who understood something Somerset ignored. Sometimes, the battle doesn't begin when swords cross. It begins when you choose the ground, when you read the weather, when you turn the environment into a silent ally. And on that frozen morning of March 29th, Norfolk saw something that made his heart race: the wind. A strong winter wind blowing directly against the Lancastrian positions. Most commanders would have ignored this detail. But Norfolk wasn't like most. He was a student of projectile warfare, a master of medieval ballistics. And he knew exactly what that wind meant. The Lancastrians had more men, more horses, and the higher ground. York was doomed. At least that's how it seemed. But Norfolk didn't want a battle. He wanted a massacre from a distance. He positioned his archers not to fight, but to create a death zone. Centuries before aviation, he was about to invent the principle of aerial bombardment. Destroy the enemy without ever being touched. Norfolk knew the wind would make his arrows travel farther. Much farther. The Lancastrian arrows, fired against the wind, would fall short. They wouldn't reach the Yorkists. But the Yorkist arrows, driven by the wind, would gain 50, 100 extra meters of range. This meant Norfolk could bombard the Lancastrian formations without suffering effective retaliation. It was the perfect trap disguised as an honest stand-up fight. The blizzard blinded everything. Beaufort, the enemy commander, looked at York's lines and saw weakness. They seemed to be merely trying to survive. Beaufort smiled. He only needed to advance, and the war would be over before lunch. He didn't know he was marching toward an execution. Here's the silent genius of the plan. Norfolk was betting that Beaufort wouldn't see the trap until it was too late. He was counting on the enemy's arrogance, on the confidence of someone with more soldiers and better knights. Beaufort thought he was leading a battle. Norfolk knew he was executing a meteorological ambush. And then, when the two armies lined up, when the drums of war began to sound through the blizzard, when the banners whipped violently in the wind, Norfolk gave the order. The Yorkist archers drew back their bows. Arrows were positioned. Thousands of men took a deep breath, adjusting their aim to the perfect angle. The wind howled like a ghost crossing the battlefield. And in that silent moment before the storm of arrows, before the first cry of pain, before blood began to stain the white snow, the Battle of Towton was about to redefine what it meant to master the field of battle. The first volley of Yorkist arrows was released. Thousands of them, rising in perfect arcs against the gray sky, driven by the wind like projectiles guided by nature itself. They flew farther than any Lancastrian expected, much farther. And on the Lancastrian side, Beaufort ordered the response. His archers fired back. Thousands of arrows rose into the air, flying against the wind, struggling against the force of nature. And then, something terrible began to happen. The enemy arrows fell, not on soldiers, but in the snow, 40 meters short of the lines. Useless. The wind had created an invisible shield. Meanwhile, the Yorkist arrows continued to rain down on the Lancastrian formations with brutal precision. Soldiers screamed when metal pierced armor. Horses thrashed when arrows struck their flanks. Formations began to disorganize as men tried to protect themselves from a shower of death that seemed to have no end. And it was in that moment that Edmund Beaufort understood his mistake. His eyes widened as he grasped the magnitude of the trap, the wind, the positioning. Norfolk's apparently defensive strategy. Everything had been calculated. Everything had been planned. And now, with his arrows wasted and his formations under constant bombardment, Beaufort had only two choices: retreat and lose the war, or push forward through the arrow storm and pray his cavalry could close the distance before his army was shredded. He chose to advance. And as the Lancastrian trumpets sounded the order to attack, as thousands of soldiers began marching through snow and blood toward the Yorkist lines, Norfolk watched with the calm of a man who knew he had already won before the battle began. When the first Lancastrian arrows fell harmlessly into the snow, Beaufort realized his mistake, but it was already too late. The order echoed across the Lancastrian lines. Advance, close the distance, turn the battle into hand-to-hand combat before Yorkist arrows destroyed their formations completely. It was the only option left to Edmund Beaufort. And deep down, he still believed that his superior numbers would make the difference when swords finally met shields. But Norfolk had calculated exactly that. As the Lancastrians began their march through snow and wind, the Yorkist archers received a simple order: steady pace. Don't fire everything at once. Don't waste arrows on uncontrolled volleys. One coordinated volley every 20 seconds, methodically, relentlessly, like a killing machine designed to destroy entire armies before they could even touch an enemy. And it worked exactly that way. The first Yorkist volley departed with a collective whistle that cut through the frozen air. 15,000 arrows flying in a high arc, driven by the furious wind at their backs. What would normally fly 200 meters now reached 300, even 350. The iron tips descended upon the Lancastrian formations like deadly rain, piercing armor, tearing through wooden shields, finding flesh and bone beneath. Men fell screaming, others stumbled over bodies. The formation wavered, and then came the second volley, 20 seconds later, exactly as Norfolk had ordered. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. The Lancastrians tried to respond. Their own archers fired back, drawing bowstrings with fingers already numb from cold. But their arrows fought against the wind, against the snow that lashed their faces, against pure physics. What should have flown 200 meters barely reached 150. Lancastrian arrows fell into the snow long before threatening any Yorkist line. Thousands of wasted projectiles, quiver after quiver emptied in futile shots. Beaufort understood the mistake in the third minute. His archers were burning ammunition without inflicting a single wound on the enemy. Meanwhile, every Yorkist volley killed dozens, hundreds. The math was brutal and simple. He ordered them to stop firing, but the damage was already done. The Lancastrian quivers were half empty. In some cases, empty. And the Yorkists kept firing with the regularity of a clock. Volley after volley after volley, each one finding targets in the dense formations that tried to advance through the storm. And then Norfolk did something that turned advantage into total slaughter. He ordered his men forward. Not far, just a few meters, enough to reach the Lancastrian arrows that had fallen uselessly in the snow. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. Perfectly good arrows, recovered from the battlefield and reloaded into Yorkist quivers. The Lancastrians had just resupplied their own assassins' ammunition. Beaufort watched from his position as reality set in like the cold that froze his bones. He was facing an enemy that not only possessed positional and environmental advantage, but now also had virtually unlimited ammunition. Every arrow his men wasted firing against the wind would now return to kill them. It was such a cruel reversal that it bordered on impossible. But it was happening right before his eyes. In the 10th minute of bombardment, the Lancastrian formations began to disintegrate, not from cowardice, not from lack of courage, but because men cannot maintain cohesion when arrows rain down on their heads without stopping. when each step forward means treading on fallen comrades, when the ground becomes slick with blood mixed into melting snow. Soldiers broke formation trying to find cover that didn't exist. Officers shouted orders swallowed by the wind. Standards wavered and then fell when their bearers were struck down by arrows that seemed to come from every angle at once. And the Yorkists kept firing, volley after volley after volley, methodically, relentlessly, like modern drones hovering over a battlefield, invisible behind a curtain of snow, able to attack with impunity, while the enemy had no effective response. The only difference was the technology. The principles were exactly the same. Range dominance, area denial, turning advance into suicide. In the 15th minute, Beaufort made the most desperate decision of his military career. He ordered the cavalry charge. They're elite, they're heavy cavalry. Men in full plate armor mounted on trained war horses. The force that was supposed to guarantee their victory on any traditional battlefield. If the infantry couldn't close the distance without being massacred, perhaps the cavalry's speed could. It was a gamble born of desperation. The trumpets sounded. Hundreds of knights spurred their mounts toward the Yorkist lines, through the snow, through the wind, through the storm of arrows that instantly turned toward this new target. The Yorkist archers adjusted their aim and began bringing down knights. Plate armor can deflect an arrow, but it cannot deflect 15,000. It was mechanical slaughter. Horses struck, falling at full gallop, crushing their riders in the snow. Arrows finding the gaps in visors, under the arms, at the necks. Of 400 cavalry, fewer than 100 reached the enemy lines, only to be disemboweled by York's lancemen, who waited fresh. Beaufort's elite cavalry charge was destroyed in less than 5 minutes, and the Yorkist archers kept firing into the infantry formations still trying to advance. In the 20th minute, Edmund Beaufort faced a truth no commander wants to admit. He had lost. Not eventually. Not if things continued this way. He had already lost. His formations were broken. His cavalry was destroyed. His archers were out of ammunition, and his men were dying in hundreds every minute the battle continued. But retreating meant losing the war. It meant surrendering the crown to Edward IV. It meant that everything they had fought for in the last decades of the Wars of the Roses would end here, on a frozen battlefield in Yorkshire. So he did the only thing he could do. He ordered his men to keep advancing, to force close combat at any cost, to turn superior numbers into an advantage before half the army was dead. It was at that moment that Norfolk knew he had won completely, because desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. Beaufort had just made the worst one. Instead of pulling back in good order, preserving what was left of his forces for another day, he was converting tactical defeat into complete annihilation. The Lancastrian formations accelerated their advance. Men ran through the snow. Some shouted war cries trying to recover courage that arrows had destroyed. Others simply ran in panic disguised as attack, wanting anything except to keep standing under the endless bombardment. And finally, after 25 minutes of one-sided slaughter, the lines collided. Swords met shields, lances pierced armor. Men screamed and bled and died in hand-to-hand combat as they had done in 1,000 battles before this one. The difference was that the Lancastrians arrived broken, exhausted, traumatized from half an hour being defenseless targets, while the Yorkists were fresh, confident, knowing they had already won. The close combat lasted less than an hour before the first Lancastrian units began to break. Not the entire line, not all at once, but one unit here, another there. Men who suddenly realized that dying gloriously wouldn't change the outcome, that staying meant certain death, that running offered at least a chance of survival. And once soldiers start breaking in medieval warfare, panic spreads like wildfire. One unit retreats. The unit next to it sees and thinks it's being abandoned, so it retreats too. And suddenly, half the formation is collapsing, and the other half is surrounded, and now everyone is running because staying means dying alone. That's exactly how it happened. The Lancastrian line disintegrated. Not slowly, not in a controlled manner. It simply broke. Thousands of men turned and ran, through the snow, through the bodies of dead comrades, toward the only escape route available, toward Cockbeck. And now the final trap revealed itself. Behind them was no open field. There was Cockbeck, a deep, frozen, deadly stream, an obstacle that well-rested, organized men could cross with care. But panicked men in heavy armor, running for their lives while enemies pursued them? That would not be a crossing. That would be a slaughter. And as the first Lancastrian soldiers reached the banks of Cockbeck, as the first men slipped on the ice and fell into the freezing water, as screams of terror began to echo over the sound of steel against steel, Norfolk watched with the cold satisfaction of a man who had orchestrated every movement of this symphony of destruction. But the true massacre had not yet begun. Between the Lancastrians and survival stood Cockbeck, a frozen stream that would become a watery grave. The first Lancastrian soldiers reached the banks of Cockbeck while arrows still rained on their backs. Exhausted men in heavy armor looked at the narrow stream before them and saw one single escape route. There was no other choice. No time to think. Just run, cross, survive. But Cockbeck wasn't some wide river with a strong current, just a winding stream with steep, ice-covered banks. Under normal conditions, rested men could cross it with care, one careful step at a time, testing the ice, searching for solid footing. But these were not rested men. They were terrified soldiers, carrying 50, 60, 70 kilos of plate armor. Men who had run through snow-covered fields, men who had watched their comrades fall, men hunted by enemies screaming victory. And when the first soldier stepped onto the frozen stream, when his weight pressed against the frozen surface, when the ice cracked and he sank into the freezing water, the tragedy began. Because he did not fall alone. Dozens of men pressed behind him. Hundreds, thousands, all pushing, all desperate, all blind with terror. And when the ice gave way, when the freezing water swallowed the first men, those behind continued pushing. There was no way to stop. The human tide was too strong. The panic was too absolute. And Edmund Beaufort, watching from an elevated position as his own guards pulled him away from the battlefield, saw the true extent of the disaster Norfolk had orchestrated. Not merely a tactical defeat, not merely a lost battle. A massacre in 3 acts. First, the arrows had shattered the formations. Thousands of men cut down by projectiles that flew farther than any Lancastrian commander had calculated. The wind, that cursed wind blowing snow into their faces, had transformed ordinary archers into long-range killing machines. Second, close combat had destroyed any hope of recovery. Because when the Yorkists finally advanced, when their swords met Lancastrian flesh, they met men already exhausted, already wounded, already broken psychologically by hours under an arrow storm. And now, the third act. The final act. The act that would transform Towton from a great defeat into a historical catastrophe. The stream. Soldiers sank into the freezing water, too heavy to swim, too desperate to reason. Plate armor, designed to protect against swords and arrows, became anchors. Men thrashed, screamed, grasped at comrades trying not to sink, only pulling others down with them. And above them, pushing them deeper, came more soldiers. More men fleeing, more weight, more bodies, more terror. The stacked bodies formed a bridge of flesh. The living trampled the dead to try to survive. Cockbeck's water turned red, not in some literary sense, literally red with the blood of thousands of men. And the ice, that false promise of safety, kept cracking, kept breaking, kept dragging men to frozen deaths. The Yorkists pursued to the bank. But they didn't need to cross. They didn't need to risk their own lives in the deadly stream. They simply watched as the river finished the work their arrows had begun. Some later estimates would speak of 10,000 dead, others of 28,000 in direct battle deaths alone. But when contemporary chroniclers counted the bodies, when they added those who drowned in Cockbeck, those hunted during the pursuit, those who died from wounds in the following days, the number reached 40,000. 40,000 men in a single day, on a single battlefield in the snow of Yorkshire. To put that in perspective, the Battle of the Somme in World War I, one of the bloodiest engagements in modern history, saw 60,000 casualties on the first day. Towton, fought with swords and arrows in the 15th century, reached 2/3 of that number. Historians would call it the medieval Somme. And not from exaggeration, from mathematical precision. But numbers don't tell the whole story of what happened on March 29th, 1461. Towton didn't just destroy an army, it obliterated an entire generation of Lancastrian nobility. The elite soldiers who'd fought for Henry VI, the families who'd controlled northern England for centuries. The commanders who'd known every valley and ridge of Yorkshire. Wiped out. Not defeated and scattered. Gone. Edward IV, the young Yorkist king who had staked everything on this battle, looked over the field as the snow finally stopped. He saw the bodies. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Scattered across miles of frozen terrain. Piled on the banks of Cockbeck like discarded firewood. And he knew he'd won his throne not through negotiation, not through legitimate inheritance, but through absolute bloodshed and total tactical domination. The War of the Roses would continue for years more. More battles would be fought. But Towton had broken the spine of Lancastrian power. The defeat was so devastating, so complete, so bloody, that Henry VI would never recover enough strength to seriously challenge Edward again. A single day, a single snowstorm, a single commander understanding that the wind could be as lethal a weapon as any sword. Cut to modern warfare, drones in Ukraine. The technology has changed, but the logic is identical. Norfolk was history's first drone operator, someone who understood that if you can destroy the enemy before they can touch you, fair fighting is for fools. He didn't win with brute strength. He won with range. It's the drone strategy. 15th century, executed with arrows instead of explosives, but functionally identical. The lessons go far beyond the battlefield. Towton teaches us something fundamental about tactical innovation. More soldiers don't guarantee victory. Better equipment doesn't guarantee victory. Tradition and experience don't guarantee victory. What determines victory is understanding. Understanding your environment. Understanding your tools. Understanding how seemingly irrelevant conditions like wind direction become the decisive factors that change everything. Somerset commanded the larger army. He had elite cavalry. He had tradition and experience. He had all the conventional markers of military advantage. But Norfolk had the wind. And on that frozen Yorkshire field, amid a blizzard that turned visibility to zero and communication to impossibility, the wind was worth more than 10,000 soldiers. Today, when military analysts study asymmetric conflicts, when strategists debate how smaller forces defeat larger adversaries, Towton remains a case study, not as historical curiosity, as a living tactical manual, because the commanders who win impossible wars are those who spot weapons where everyone else sees just weather. They're the ones who turn geography into strategy. They understand that every battle holds hidden variables, waiting to be exploited by sufficiently creative minds. On March 29, 1461, on a snow-covered field in Yorkshire, 80,000 soldiers learned a lesson that still echoes in modern warfare. The commander who understands the wind controls the battlefield. Norfolk understood the wind. Beaufort did not. And 40,000 men paid the price of that difference in perception. If you were blown away by how tactical genius can overcome impossible odds, if this breakdown of medieval strategy grabbed you, hit that like button. It tells me you want more deep dive analyses of battles where brains beat brute force. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week we're breaking down another incredible upset. How 300 Swiss farmers used mountain terrain to utterly humiliate an entire Habsburg army. Alpine traps, heavy armor on steep terrain, and a brutal reminder of why invaders never win against defenders fighting on their home turf. Until next time. In the right hands, even a blizzard becomes a weapon of mass destruction.